The US-Israel-Iran War, a comprehensive and detailed breakdown. One. Introduction. A war that has changed the Middle East. The Middle East is once again at the center of global attention, but this time the stakes even higher than many previous crises. What had long been a shadow conflict between Israel and Iran has now escalated into a direct war involving the United States, creating one of the most dangerous geopolitical confrontations in recent memory. The conflict is no longer confined to covert operations, proxy battles, or isolated strikes. It has expanded into direct attacks on military targets, energy infrastructure, shipping routes, and urban areas, producing not only mass casualties but also international economic shockwaves. Major reporting now treats this as a war that began on February 28, 2026, and since then it has widened across Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Gulf waters, and strategic maritime corridors. This is not merely another regional flare-up. It is a conflict that touches nearly every major strategic pressure point in the modern world: energy security, nuclear risk, maritime trade, proxy warfare, civilian vulnerability, and great power alignment. The consequences are already visible in surging oil prices, shaken markets, diplomatic scrambling, and fears that the conflict could still grow even larger. What makes this war especially significant is that it has moved beyond the old pattern of deniable action and entered the realm of open interstate confrontation. That alone marks a historic shift. 2. The long road to war. To understand the present war, it is necessary to understand that this conflict did not begin in a vacuum. For years, Israel and Iran were engaged in what many analysts called a shadow war. Iran expanded its influence through allied and aligned groups across the region, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen. Israel, seeing this network as a direct long-term threat, responded through covert strikes, assassinations, cyber operations, sabotage, and repeated attacks on Iranian-linked targets. The United States, while not always participating in the same way as Israel, consistently viewed Iran as one of the main challenges to regional order, particularly because of Iran's missile programs, naval harassment in Gulf waters, and nuclear ambitions. For a long time, the conflict remained partly hidden. That ambiguity allowed all sides to retaliate without necessarily triggering full-scale war. But ambiguity has now collapsed. The present phase is direct, visible, and far more difficult to contain. Instead of isolated acts below the threshold of war, the region is now witnessing sustained strikes, retaliatory attacks, and openly declared military objectives. The transition from shadow conflict to direct war is one of the most important developments in the modern history of the Middle East. 3. Why the United States is involved. The United States says its campaign is not symbolic and not limited to a single punitive strike. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has publicly described the U.S. military operation as aimed at destroying the threat posed by Iran's short-range ballistic missiles and degrading Iran's naval capabilities. He also framed the broader effort as part of a campaign to weaken major components of Iran's military power. That matters because it signals that Washington is not merely reacting to an isolated event, it is pursuing a defined military objective against Iranian capabilities. From the US perspective, Iran is not simply another adversarial state. American policymakers have long viewed Tehran as a strategic threat because of its missile stockpiles, its ability to disrupt shipping in the Gulf, its support for armed movements across the region, and the unresolved question of its nuclear potential. In wartime logic, US officials appear to believe that if Iran's missile forces and naval assets are not severely weakened, the conflict will remain dangerous not just for Israel but for US personnel, allies, and commercial transit throughout the region. 4. Why Israel sees Iran as an existential threat. Israel's view of Iran goes beyond ordinary rivalry. Israeli leaders have long presented Iran as the single most serious long-term strategic danger facing the country. This concern rests on several factors at once: Iran's missile arsenal, its nuclear program, and its support for multiple hostile armed groups that can pressure Israel from different directions. To Israel, Iran is not just a distant enemy, it is the central source behind multiple threats that can converge at once. That is why any serious Iranian advance in missile capability or nuclear development is interpreted in Israel not as a manageable risk, but as a potentially existential one. This also explains why Israel's war aims overlap with America's but are not identical. The United States emphasizes missile and naval threats. Israel's strategic concern is broader. Israel wants to reduce Iran's overall capacity to arm partners, deter Israeli action, and sustain long-range military pressure. In simple terms, Israel wants not only to survive this war, but to emerge from it with Iran significantly weakened for the future. 5. Iran's position. Deterrence, survival, and retaliation. Iran sees the war through a different lens. From Tehran's perspective, the United States and Israel are trying to cripple the country's military power, weaken its regional influence, and possibly threaten the survival of the regime itself. In such a framework, retaliation is not merely revenge. It is a message. Iran must show that it cannot be attacked without imposing serious costs in return. That is the core logic of deterrence. If Iran appears unable to retaliate effectively, it risks inviting even greater pressure from its enemies in the future. This explains why Iran's strategy is not limited to defending territory. It includes striking where it can create leverage: military bases, economic choke points, oil shipping, and regional instability. Iran's goal is not necessarily to win in a conventional sense against stronger military powers. Its goal is to make the costs of war so high that its enemies cannot easily continue or dictate terms. That is one reason this conflict remains so dangerous. All sides think backing down carries its own unacceptable risks. 6. The official beginning of the current war. Recent reporting from AP identifies the current war as beginning on February 28, 2026. That date matters because it distinguishes the current direct conflict from the long-running shadow war that preceded it. This is not one uninterrupted war stretching back for decades. It is a new and more overt phase in which the United States, Israel, and Iran are now engaged in direct and sustained confrontation. Since that date, the death toll has climbed into the thousands, major infrastructure has been hit, and the conflict has spilled across state borders and into vital economic corridors. When people discuss this conflict, precision matters. The older Israel-Iran hostility was real, but the current war is being treated by major outlets as a distinct direct phase. That distinction is useful for your video because it helps viewers understand that while the roots are old, the present war is a dramatic escalation rather than a continuation of the exact same format. 7. What the battlefield looks like right now. The battlefield is not one battlefield. That is one of the most important realities of this war. Fighting and retaliation are taking place in Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Gulf waters, and adjacent regional corridors. AP reported that the United States struck Isfahan, a city associated with a major Iranian nuclear facility, while Iran retaliated by hitting a Kuwaiti oil tanker near Dubai. That exchange alone shows how the war has fused military targets with global economic pressure points. A nuclear-linked city is struck. An oil tanker is hit near one of the region's most important commercial hubs. The war moves instantly from strategy maps to energy markets. The regional spread is also visible in Lebanon, where Israel's operations against Hezbollah have intensified and have reportedly caused deaths among UN peacekeepers as well as Israeli soldiers. This shows that the war is not limited to US-Iran or Israel-Iran exchanges alone. It is pulling in the broader regional network that has always surrounded the core rivalry. 8. Has Iran been seriously weakened? Yes, but not completely. US claims describe a campaign that has struck thousands of targets and badly damaged large parts of Iran's military, industrial, and naval capacity. However, outside reporting suggests that Iran still retains substantial retaliatory power. Estimates cited in reporting indicate that only around one-third of Iran's missile and drone arsenal may have been destroyed so far. That means Tehran still has significant capacity to retaliate with missiles, drones, mobile systems, underground storage, and regional allies. This is crucial because it explains why the war has not ended quickly despite heavy US and Israeli attacks. Military damage does not automatically equal strategic collapse. Iran may be weaker than before, but it remains dangerous. In wars of attrition, the ability to keep fighting often matters as much as the size of the damage already sustained. 9. Civilian casualties and the human cost. The humanitarian cost of this war is severe and rising. AP reported that the conflict has already killed more than 3,000 people. That toll spans Iran, Lebanon, Israel, Gulf states, and related fronts. Civilian suffering is not a side issue in this war. It is central to how the conflict is being perceived and remembered. Civilian infrastructure has also been caught in the destruction. Reporting has described strikes that affected schools, hospitals, and urban areas. Every war creates narratives, and civilian deaths rapidly become some of the most powerful symbols in those narratives. The more civilian losses mount, the harder diplomacy becomes, because public anger intensifies and governments face growing pressure not to appear weak or accommodating. That political effect can prolong war as much as battlefield logic does. 10. Why images of civilian tragedy matter strategically in modern warfare. Tragedy is not only a moral issue but also a strategic one. Images of destroyed schools, funerals, injured children, and smoking urban neighborhoods travel faster than military briefings. They shape how populations understand the war. They harden attitudes. They create martyrs and symbols. They make compromise harder. In this war, several reports have highlighted particularly emotional civilian incidents, and those episodes are becoming part of the political memory of the conflict. That matters because wars are fought on two levels at once: the physical battlefield and the narrative battlefield. On the physical battlefield, states calculate targets, assets, and logistics. On the narrative battlefield, they fight over legitimacy, victimhood, and blame. Civilian suffering can influence both domestic support and international opinion, and in a conflict involving US and Israeli actions against Iranian targets, global scrutiny is intense. 11. The Strait of Hormuz. Why the world is watching. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. A large share of the world's oil and gas passes through it. When conflict threatens Hormuz, the result is not simply a regional shipping problem. It becomes a global economic alarm. AP reported that the war has pushed Brent crude above $106 per barrel, while other reporting has described one of the strongest monthly oil surges in recent years. Europe's March inflation rise has also been linked to energy disruption tied to the war. That is why Hormuz sits at the center of so much strategic discussion. Iran knows that threatening the strait creates leverage well beyond the battlefield. The US and its partners know that if the strait remains under pressure, the economic damage can become global very quickly. This means the war is not only about land targets or military exchanges. It is also about who can control or deny access to a vital energy choke point. 12. The attack on oil shipping and why it matters. The Iranian strike on a Kuwaiti oil tanker near Dubai is one of the clearest examples of how the conflict threatens the world economy. According to reporting, the attack set off a fire and heightened fears of a broader oil spill or shipping crisis, even though the immediate worst-case scenario was avoided. The symbolic importance of such an attack is enormous. It tells markets, governments, and shipping companies that commercial oil movement is no longer safely separate from the conflict. Once shipping comes under threat, the costs ripple outward. Insurers raise premiums. Tanker routes change. Traders price in greater risk. Governments fear shortages. Consumers feel the consequences through fuel, transportation, and inflation. This is one reason the war matters as much in Europe and Asia as it does in the Middle East. A strike near Dubai is not just a regional incident. It is a signal to the global economy. 13. Karg Island and the debate over escalation. Another major issue in current reporting is Karg Island, the hub that handles the majority of Iran's oil exports. AP reported discussion within Washington about the possibility of seizing or disabling Karg as a way to intensify pressure on Iran, though experts warned that such a move would be highly risky, difficult to sustain, and likely to trigger major retaliation. The Karg debate reveals how this war could become even more dangerous. Once military planning turns toward an adversary's core economic lifelines, the conflict is no longer just about reducing battlefield threats. It begins to resemble a broader campaign to break national endurance. That can sometimes force negotiations, but it can also radicalize resistance and widen the war. In Iran's case, a direct assault on such a crucial oil node could provoke retaliation not just in the Gulf but through allied actors elsewhere in the region. 14. The Houthi factor and the Red Sea threat. This war is not confined to the Gulf. The Houthis, aligned with Iran, have entered the conflict more directly, and their involvement matters because of geography. They sit near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, another vital maritime choke point linking the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. AP reporting notes that this area carries a significant share of global trade, and previous Houthi attacks on merchant shipping had already shown how disruptive they can be. If Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb are both under pressure, the consequences become global very quickly. One threatens Persian Gulf energy exports, the other threatens Red Sea shipping and transit toward the Suez Canal. In effect, a regional war begins to place multiple global arteries under stress at once. That is why the Houthi role is not a side story. It is one of the reasons the conflict has such broad international implications. 15. Lebanon and the Northern Front. Lebanon has become another major theater in the wider crisis. AP reported deaths among UN peacekeepers and Israeli troops during Israel's offensive in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. This matters because Hezbollah has long been one of Iran's most important and capable regional partners. Any large-scale conflict involving Hezbollah raises the danger that the war will become even more entrenched and more destructive. The Lebanon front also illustrates a deeper point. Iran's regional influence means the war can never be understood only through direct state-to-state strikes. Iran's strategic reach includes organizations and pressure points across several countries. That multiplies the number of ways the conflict can escalate, and it makes any ceasefire more fragile because even if one front cools, another front can reignite tensions. 16. The Gulf states. Fear, calculation, and division. One of the more striking developments in recent reporting is that some Gulf allies are privately urging the United States to keep fighting until Iran is decisively weakened. AP reported that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain have pushed Trump to continue pressure, while Oman and Qatar have favored a diplomatic solution. This divide is important. It shows that the region is not united around one endgame. Some states see the war as a rare opportunity to permanently reduce Iranian power. Others fear that a longer war could destabilize the Gulf itself, threaten infrastructure, and worsen the economic fallout. These are not abstract disagreements. They reflect different levels of vulnerability, different diplomatic traditions, and different expectations about what kind of post-war regional order might emerge. 17. The global economic shock. The economic effects of the war are already visible. Oil prices have surged. Inflation has picked up in Europe. Fuel prices have climbed in multiple markets. Businesses dependent on transport and energy are under pressure. AP reported that Europe's inflation rose to 2.5% in March, up from 1.9% in February, with the conflict and energy disruption described as major drivers. This matters because the war is no longer just a security story. It is now a cost of living story as well. When oil and gas prices rise, food transport gets more expensive, factories face higher costs, airlines pay more, and political leaders far from the battlefield feel domestic pressure. A Middle Eastern war becomes a political issue in Rome, Berlin, London, Delhi, Beijing, and Washington because households and businesses absorb the consequences. 18. Water infrastructure and the threat of humanitarian escalation. One especially alarming development has been discussion of targeting desalination and energy infrastructure. AP reported warnings that destroying desalination capacity in the Gulf could produce severe humanitarian consequences because many states there rely heavily on desalinated water. Analysts cited in the report said such action could trigger a cascading regional crisis and might raise serious questions under the laws of war. This matters because it shows how easily modern war can move from military confrontation into basic survival systems. Water, electricity, fuel, and food distribution are not just infrastructure categories. They are what keep civilian life functioning. Once they become bargaining chips or targets, the war moves into an even more dangerous humanitarian phase. 19. Why diplomacy has struggled. Diplomatic efforts exist, but they are weak and uncertain. AP has reported mediation activity involving regional players and noted conflicting accounts about ceasefire terms, demands, and willingness to negotiate. The core problem is familiar in war. Each side thinks continued pressure might improve its bargaining position. For the United States and Israel, stopping too soon may look like leaving Iran dangerous enough to recover. For Iran, negotiating under heavy bombardment may look like surrender under duress. That is why ceasefire talks are so difficult. The battlefield has not yet clearly convinced all sides that compromise is better than continued escalation. Until that calculation changes, diplomacy will remain fragile. 20. What each side wants. The United States wants Iran's missile threat reduced, its naval pressure degraded, and its broader military capability weakened. Israel wants a strategic rollback of Iranian power, not just a pause in attacks. Iran wants regime survival, preserved deterrence, and proof that attacking it comes at unacceptable cost. These objectives are not easily reconcilable. That is why this war is so dangerous. It is not merely about stopping one attack or responding to one provocation. It is about future order. Who will emerge weaker? Who will still be feared? Who will control escalation next time? Those questions make limited compromise much harder. 21. The risk of a wider war. The risk of broader escalation remains real. Additional attacks on energy infrastructure, deeper US deployments, wider Gulf involvement, or more sustained proxy attacks could all enlarge the conflict further. AP reporting already points to extra deployments, intensifying regional pressure, and the possibility of even more aggressive options under discussion. The structure of the conflict itself makes escalation easier than de-escalation. There are too many fronts, too many armed actors, and too many strategic assets at stake. A single successful strike on a symbolic or economically vital target could trigger a much harsher next phase. That is the logic of widening wars. Not every escalation is planned, but each one makes the next more plausible. 22. What this war means for the future of the Middle East. Even if a ceasefire is reached soon, the Middle East that emerges afterward will not be the same as the one that existed before February 28, 2026. The war has already changed assumptions about deterrence, exposed the vulnerability of shipping routes, intensified the centrality of missile warfare, and shown how quickly economic systems can be shaken by regional conflict. It has also deepened the fusion of military and economic warfare. In a deeper sense, this war marks the end of an era. The older model of shadow confrontation between Israel and Iran is giving way to something more direct, more open, and more globally consequential. The United States is no longer just backing one side from a distance. Iran is no longer responding only through quiet, deniable channels. The region has crossed into a more explicit and dangerous phase of power struggle. 23. Final conclusion. The US-Israel-Iran war is one of the defining geopolitical crises of 2026. It is a war about missiles, but also about deterrence. It is a war about nuclear anxiety, but also about economic choke points and regional order. It is a war about military objectives, but also about the suffering of civilians and the fragility of global systems. The battlefield stretches from Iranian cities to Gulf waters, from Lebanese front lines to oil markets in Europe and beyond. What happens next will depend on whether the main actors conclude that continued war serves them better than negotiation. For now, that answer is still unclear. And that uncertainty is exactly why the world is watching so closely. This is not just a Middle East conflict anymore. It is a test of how far regional war can spread before it becomes something even larger. Share it with someone and subscribe to Uncovering Facts for deep, hype-free documentaries on AI, truth, power, and the systems shaping modern life.